this evening to the book of Ecclesiastes, and we're in chapter 5. This chapter, as the study kind of breaks down into two themes, two thoughts, one short one and then one longer one. In these there's 20 verses here, verses 1 through 7, is kind of some instruction and admonitions about not making rash, foolish promises, and about being careful what we say, especially in the presence of the Lord. And then verses 8 through 20 has to do with the vanity of riches. In chapter 5, verse 1, let us read these first 7 verses first of all. It said, "Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon the earth. Therefore let thy words be few. For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by multitude of words. When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldst not vow than thou shouldst vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin, neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of thy hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also divers vanities, but fear thou God." And so this first section here, these first 7 verses, deals with and warns us about making rash promises or vows before God. And so, the context here is especially when we come into God's house, or when we come before, as in the biblical times, in the days of Solomon and prior to him, the days of David, the temple, where the people would come into the temple area and pray. People would come and bring their offerings and sacrifices there. This is where God was said to meet with his people, and they would come before him, and people would come there to pray and offer up their prayers before God. And so today in his church, this is where he says he meets with his people. This is where we come into his presence. We offer up prayers and worship. And people see the sanctuary and see God's house as a place where they are closer to God, and they are in his presence. He has promised to be here in a special way. He's everywhere. You know, he is omnipresent. He is spirit, and God is everywhere through his creation. But there is that particular sense in which he is present in his church, in his sanctuary, and people come before him. And so it admonishes us to consider that and to be careful when we come into his presence, that we are in the presence of God. He is a holy and righteous God, and he does hear our words. He sees the thoughts and intents of our heart, and so we need to be careful. And it admonishes us to be ready to hear, but slow to speak. He goes on to say, let thy words be few. He said, be not rash with thy mouth. Is don't be in a hurry to say something that you might later have cause to regret having said. And the idea is in making a vow, that is promising God that you're going to do something. You know, a lot of people at New Year's, they make New Year's resolutions, but the joke, the idea is that everybody ever keeps their resolutions. They make these resolutions, they're going to do this, do that, and then they don't follow through. He's saying here, you don't make promises to God that you're not going to be able to keep, that you're not going to follow through on. It is a serious thing. And I think a lot of times people, when they get into trouble, they're having a difficult time, and they turn to God to help them. And I think this is especially true of those who really are not close to God. And He's just kind of out there somewhere in their lives. They believe there is a God, but when they really get into deep trouble, then they come and crying to Him to help them, and they start making promises. They try to make deals with God. God, if you'll just do this for me, if you'll just get me out of this mess, if you'll just, then I promise I will, whatever. And that's what it's talking about. And so don't be in a rush to say things like that and to try to deal with God. We don't really deal with Him. He doesn't play let's make a deal. He is a sovereign God, and we need to come before Him. And it is all right for us to pray and to ask God for help. And He wants us to look to Him for our help. He is our God. That's what He's there for. That's His covenant relationship with us as His people. He wants us to look to Him as the source of our strength, as the source of our help, as the source of our comfort. And we need to understand that and realize we don't have to try to make deals with Him. If you feel led of the Lord to make a vow, that's one thing, but be sure what you're doing. That's where He said, be slow to speak. So be ready to listen. Because God will speak to us. He'll speak to us through His Word. He will reveal things to us. And He'll speak to our hearts. And we need to be more ready to listen to what He has to say than to just start making rash promises. And so, one of the instances that stands out over in the book of Judges, Jephthah, Judges chapter 11. Joshua, Judges. Judges chapter 11 and verse 29. Now it says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed over Gilead and Manasseh, and passed over Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he passed over unto the children of Ammon. And Jephthah vowed a vow unto the Lord, and said, if thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into my hands, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the children of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jephthah passed over unto the children of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. If the Lord has called you to do something, then trust Him that He is going to give the victory. But we see here Jephthah made a vow. He said, if you'll deliver them into my hands and give me victory, then when I come home, the first thing that comes out of the door, I'm going to offer up as a burnt offering to you. Well, as we begin begin reading then in verse 34. And Jephthah came to Mizpah unto his own house, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and with dances, and she was his only child. Beside her he had neither son nor daughter. And it came to pass when he saw her that he rent his clothes, and said, Alas, my daughter, thou hast brought me very low. And thou art one of them that trouble me, for I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot go back. You know, it is a serious thing, and so we need to be careful what we vow before God. And that's what Solomon is saying here, and I'm sure he's aware of the history. He was aware of what Jephthah did, and he was aware of human nature. He may even have made some vows of his own from time to time. And so he warns us about this very thing. And he goes on because he's talking about, in verse 3, he says, And a fool's voice is known by multitude of words. That is, a fool is known by his much speaking. A wise person will keep counsel to himself. A wise person does not utter all his mind, what we're told in Proverbs, but a fool uttereth all his mind, or says everything that comes to mind. And a fool's voice is known by a multitude of words, or by his much speaking. You know, and I know sometimes people, and they just ramble on and on. I need to be careful, because sometimes I get up here preaching and I can ramble on and on. But just kind of foolish stuff, and you have to kind of step back and look at them and wonder, what are you talking about? You know, you're just talking nonsense. And so it is true. And again, so like when I was in Bible college, one of the teachers said, you know, it is better to keep your mouth shut and have people think you're a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. And I believe Solomon here would agree with that advice. And he goes on to say, he says, Better is it, well, in verse 4, when thou vowest a vow to God, defer not to pay it. That is, don't neglect paying it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. It said, Better is it that thou shouldst not vow than thou shouldst vow and not pay. And so again, I think this comes back to that, you know, let your words be few. Listen first before you open your mouth, not just before men, but before God. And make a vow that you're not going to be able or willing to keep. And so verse 6 says, Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin, neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. I said, oops, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have vowed that. I take it back. Now, I said, you know, if you vowed a vow, you pay it. The wise thing is don't make a vow unless you understand what it is you're going to do and are willing and able to follow through on that vow. I said, Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of thy hands? He said, For in the multitude of dreams and many words there are also divers vanities. You know, out of the multitude of these things, he said, be careful, because there's a lot of emptiness, a lot of vain things, a lot of vain thoughts, a lot of vain words. And the more talk, the more vanity you're going to come up with. And so he warned, said the bottom line is just fear thou God. Psalm 89 verse 7 where it says, God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints, and to be had in reverence of all those that are about him. That's kind of the bottom. If when we come into his presence, if we have that godly fear and a reverence, then we will probably conduct ourselves as we ought. It's when we lose sight of that and come into his presence rashly and say things rashly that we have not considered what we're saying or what we're doing in the light of we're in the presence of Almighty God, and he's a holy God, and he does not look well on foolishness. And so he says, but fear thou God. It's kind of the bottom line here. Fear thou God. He is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints, and to be had in reverence of all those that are about him. Then, beginning in verse 8, he shifts subjects here. He shifts his train of thought from the rash promises and much speaking in the presence of God to the vanity, if you will, of riches. Now, my Bible has the heading of vanity of life, but I think this has more to do in particular with the vanity of riches, the desire to accumulate wealth, which it underscores the attitude of greed and covetousness, which is sin. And here, Solomon, the richest man in the world, I think he would be richer in his day even than what Bill Gates and some of these men are today. He was the richest man, and probably the richest man that has ever lived. And yet here he speaks out about the vanity of riches. You know, it is one thing if a poor man complains about riches and those that are rich. But when a rich man looks at himself and he sees the vanity of it, he's speaking from a position of experience and authority on the subject, as Solomon was a rich man. And so he begins here, if thou seest the oppression of the poor, and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. And one of the things he's saying is, you know, if you see this injustice, don't be surprised. You know, men are sinners, and men in high places are sinners, and there will be corruption. And we see this corruption centered around here, I believe, the idea of wealth, the oppression of the poor. That is, if there's a question at law between a rich man and a poor man, the rich man's going to win. You know, that may not be just, but Solomon's saying, don't be surprised if you see it happen. He said, but he encourages us in this, that there is one who is higher than the highest authority on earth, who regards it. It's not gone unnoticed in the scheme of things. God sees, and he will bring about a recompense of reward for these actions. Men will have to give an account. Even kings one day will stand before God, even as the lowliest beggar, and give an account of himself to God. And so he encourages us in that matter. And I think this fits with the idea of the vanity of riches, because as we saw in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 27. Let's go back there. Proverbs 15, 27 says, "He that is greedy of gain troubleth his own house, but he that hateth gifts shall live." And I think the key here to this thought is hateth gifts or bribes. He that is greedy troubleth his own house, but he that hateth gift shall live. In Proverbs 17:23, "A wicked man taketh a gift out of the bosom to pervert the ways of judgment." And so, bribery, kickbacks, these types of things were common. What was it? Paul said there in Corinth, "There's no temptation taken you but such as is common to man." These things are common because human nature is the same. And human nature involves greed, corruption. And so these various forms or manifestations of greed and corruption, and especially we see here with the idea of perverting judgment. And I think that is what he's talking about here. Perverting judgment. "If thou seest oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice." And the prophets said, "Marvel not at the matter, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there it be higher than they." Moreover, he goes on to say here in verse 9, "The profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field." Whereas he has said, there is profit over the Proverbs, he says there's profit in all labor. Here he is viewing the vanity, the emptiness of pursuing riches as an end in of itself. And he's saying the profit of the earth, and that is the labor, because we labor to till the soil, to raise the crops, to harvest, that there might be food. That's what he told Adam after the fall there in the Garden of Eden. He said, because of sin, from dust thou wast taken, and to dust shalt thou return, and by the sweat of your brow you will earn, labor for your bread until you return to the dust. And so the earth no longer gives forth its bounty freely, but we must labor and sweat and toil in order to produce that which is necessary to sustain our lives. And so, but he's talking about the profit of the earth is for all. It's there for all. So even the king is fed through the labor and all to produce from the earth. And with that said, he said, "He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity." He that loveth silver, he that loveth abundance. Now in 1 Timothy chapter 6, we see Paul speaking on this same subject and same train of thought. 1 Timothy 6, beginning with verse 1, It says, let as many servants as are under the yoke count their masters worthy of all honor, that the name of God and his doctrine be not blasphemed. And they that are believing masters, let them not despise them, because they are brethren, but rather do them service, because they are faithful and beloved, partakers of the benefit. These things teach and exhort. If any man teach otherwise, and consent not to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which is according to godliness, he is proud, knowing nothing, but doting about questions and strife of words, whereof cometh envy, strife, railings, evil surmising, perverse disputings of men of corrupt minds, and destitute of the truth, supposing that gain is godliness. From such withdraw thyself. And so he goes through this to get to this thought that behind all of this, doting about questions and railings and evil surmising, perverse disputings, and so on, is supposing that gain is godliness. From such withdraw thyself. But godliness with contentment is great gain. And so here Paul is setting forth the example that godliness with contentment, that we live godly lives, live in a way that's pleasing to God, obeying him, fear God and keep his commandments, same as in the Old Testament, same as he said here in the first part, just fear God and be content. He said that is great gain. That is true gain. Godliness with contentment. And he goes on to say, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And this goes right along with what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. And said, having food and raiment, let us be there with content. Verse 9, he contrasts that contentment with the opposite. He says, but they that will be rich. Doesn't say they that are rich, but he says those that desire to be rich, that make that their goal in life, fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. So you're laying yourself open to Satan's temptations and snares, and you'll make some foolish decisions that is going to result in harm to you. And what was it? He that we read back there in Proverbs 15:27. If I can find that again. He that is greedy of gain troubleth his own house. You know, he says he hurtful lusts. And he says in verse 10, for the love of money, so he says, he that hateth gifts shall live. But he that loveth money, and it says here, he that loveth silver, he that loveth abundance, he that loveth money, for the love of money is the root of all evil. Money is not the root of all evil. Silver and gold is not the root of all evil. Abundance is not the root of all evil. It is the love of it, the lust for it, the greed, the covetousness. These are sins that come forth out of the heart. And that's what Jesus taught. It's not the things that are outside of us that is sinful, that defile us. It's what's in the heart that defiles man. Because it's the greed, it's the lust, it's the covetousness that dwells in our hearts as part of that old depraved nature that manifests itself in our behavior, in our thinking, in the choices that we make, and the things then that we do. And so it's that love, that greed, that covetousness, which is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. And so this was Paul's warning as well. And Solomon is pointing out here that he that loveth silver should not be satisfied with silver. It's one of those things about human, it's never enough. If contentment is being able to say, well, that's enough. I don't need any more. That's contentment. You may have gone, I might like a little more, but I don't really need any more. And you're willing to be content with what you have. That's what Paul says. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Where we're able to overcome and subdue those natural desires for wealth. Because greed, lust, covetousness is never satisfied. It's never enough. I believe that's one of the reasons that Jesus pointed out in the parable of the sower, talking about those things, that deceitfulness of riches. Riches, the allure of wealth, is deceitful. Solomon says this is vanity. Riches are a vanity, and with the increase in riches comes an increase in cares, worry, sleeplessness, all of these things that go with it. He says in verse 11 and 12, when goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much. But the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. So there, all the cares and all that go with it. A man that labors, that works, and gathers together that fruit of his labor, he can sleep. Whether it be a little or whether it be much, he has sleep. He said, but the rich man, he said, does not allow him to sleep. The worries, the cares, these things prevent him from sleeping. Verse 13 through 17, he points out another sore evil which I have seen under the sun. It's related. The greed and here in particular is evidenced by a miserly or stingy attitude. There is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. They keep back, and they won't turn loose. They won't spend it on anything. They hoard it up, and they do so to their own hurt. He said, but those riches perish by evil travail. And he begetteth a son, and there is nothing in his hand. It says, a good man leaveth an inheritance for his son. But here we see that the wicked, or the evil here, when he becomes greedy and miserly, he said, those riches perish. He says, by evil travail. It goes back verse 11. When goods increase, there increase that eat them. So it will perish. And here he points out what Paul pointed out. As he came forth of his mother's womb naked, shall he return and go as he came, and shall take nothing of his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a sore evil, that in all points as it came, so shall he go. And what profit hath he that hath labored for the wind? And again, this is the people get greedy, they lose. Says this is a sore evil. Verse 13. We see this covetousness, held back by greed, shall perish. No good will come of wealth gotten in greed and covetousness, and held for the same reason, or sickness of heart. He calls it in verse 17. He said, all his days also he eateth in darkness, and he hath much sorrow and wrath with his sickness. It's a sickness of heart. And nothing left to pass on. The purpose here is, why would someone just hoard up things? We cannot keep our material gain in death. We can't take it with us. So why do we hoard it up, and not willing to spend? These things, understand that the material things of this life are needful to sustain life. And there is a right purpose and use for it. It's to be used for one's own needs, for the needs of his family. Paul set forth the teaching there, said, if a man provide not for his own, especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Part of the purpose that we labor and we acquire not just riches, but we labor, and the fruit of our labor is that we might provide for ourselves, that we might provide for our family. We see that we might provide for God's house, and we might provide for the needy. These are the proper uses of wealth, whether it be a small amount or a large amount. We are stewards over these things, and God holds us to account for our stewardship. And if we're faithful, He will increase that which He entrusts to us. But if we're greedy, that which we have, we will lose. That's what He's saying here. In verse 18 through 20, behold, that which I have seen, it is good and comely for one to eat and to drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Which God giveth him, our lot in life, our portion, that which God determines, this is what I want you to have, and we're content with it. That we learn to be content with that which God has given to us. So He says, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and these things will be added to you. God knows you have need of these things. He has promised to supply and provide for our needs. And we need to learn to be content and to faithfully use those things. So it is His portion, but when we get greedy and we want more, we want our portion to be greater, and so on, then this becomes a problem. And goes on, verse 19. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. Here again, even those that are blessed with more than what is necessary to sustain our life, it is for a reason. And we can enjoy that portion when we're content, and we enjoy the portion that God has given to us that meets our needs, and He gives us abundance. Then that abundance is to be used to help others, not just for ourselves, but then our families, the maintenance of God's house and God's work, for those in need. This is the reason for these things. For He shall not much remember the days of his life. And as I was studying this verse, it has the idea of even if he has not much, he remembers his days are numbered of the Lord, who gives him his portion and the ability to enjoy the fruit of his labors all the days that God has given him, and is content with his lot or portion, is kind of the idea that is set forth in this verse. Jesus said, "A man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesses. Neither the success nor the happiness of a man's life is determined by how much he has, but rather on his contentment in God." And in that contentment, being satisfied with the portion that God has given us, and to enjoy that out of our labors that we have labored. That is our portion, and that is what God has given us, and we are to learn to be content with that. Everything else is vanity. Vanity of vanities and vexation of spirit, saith the preacher. All is vanity. And so, as Solomon, seeks to put the benefit of his experience and his wisdom and his observations and pass it on to others that God had given him. And some of this is through his mistakes that he had made, not only mistakes he observed others make, but mistakes which he had made. And when he talks about the bitterness and these things, he's probably speaking from experience. He had experienced that bitterness and so on. That as he increased in wealth, those increased around him that wanted to consume that which he had labored for and had made. And so he looks at it and says, and it's all vanity. It's all empty. The main thing is fear God. And be content with your portion that God has given you out of the labor, the fruits of the labor that you have labored under the sun. And to use those things for God. Our happiness is not in the abundance, but in the contentment. Let us stand together.